Richard's mansion gleamed under the glow of the evening lights. The crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceilings exuded an air of cold sophistication, just like everything else in his life. Upstairs, in front of a grand mirror, Richard meticulously adjusted his tie. His custom Italian suit, a symbol of his wealth and power, fit him perfectly. He ran a hand through his neatly styled dark hair, checked his precisely trimmed beard, and smirked in satisfaction. Nothing could go wrong tonight. The gala was a key event, a stepping stone to expand his network of international investors. In his world, image was everything. Downstairs, Mary was finishing the dishes. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual, as if echoing the growing distance between her and Richard. The faint sound of his footsteps upstairs reminded her of what she already knew. He was getting ready for a party, one she hadn't been invited to. She placed the last plate on the rack, dried her hands on her apron, and stared out the window. The glass reflected nothing but emptiness. When Richard descended the stairs, Mary leaned against the kitchen counter, cradling a cup of tea. He entered the room with the indifference of a man who had already checked out. He adjusted his cufflinks with the confidence of someone about to conquer the world. For a fleeting moment, she admired him, just as she had for years, but that admiration was now tainted with bitter disappointment. The man she had once adored felt like a stranger. "You look handsome," she said softly, offering a small, timid smile. It was genuine, but it carried a longing for something that no longer existed. He barely looked at her. "Thank you." Silence stretched between them as he slipped his phone into his pocket. Mary felt a tightness in her chest. She didn't want to seem desperate, but she couldn't stop herself from asking, "Where are you going tonight?" Richard exhaled, a quiet sigh that sliced through the fragile armor Mary had wrapped around herself. "It's a business event. Something important. Don't worry, I won't be home too late." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words, even as they cut through her like a blade. He picked up his blazer, glanced around briefly, and for a moment, she thought he might say something kind. Something that could reassure her. But he simply adjusted his collar and opened the door. "Take care, Mary," he said distantly. Without waiting for a response, he left. The door closed, and silence reclaimed the house. Mary stood motionless, staring at the spot where he had been just moments before, listening to the fading sound of his car tires against the pavement. She closed her eyes, allowing memories to flood her mind. She remembered the day she met Richard, in a bustling downtown cafe. He wasn't the powerful millionaire he was today, just a young man with big dreams and an irresistible charm. They had talked for hours, laughing, sharing stories. He spoke of building an empire but also of the simple joys of life. She had fallen in love with both his ambition and his warmth. In the early days of their marriage, he would hold her hand in public, leave sweet notes on her pillow. Their nights were filled with dreams of a future they would build together. But as Richard climbed the social ladder, he began to change. He started critiquing her, first her clothes, then her voice, and eventually, her entire existence. The affectionate gestures faded. Their conversations became short, emotionless transactions. The events they used to attend as a couple were now filled with women like Daphne, Richard's latest mistress. Back in the present, Mary opened her eyes and took a deep breath. The pain was still there, but tonight, something felt different. She turned and walked up the stairs toward a long-forgotten room. Inside, dust-covered canvases, paintbrushes, and sketchbooks waited in silence. For years, she had locked away this part of herself, believing that her only role was to support Richard's ambitions. But tonight, as she traced her fingers over a blank canvas, she felt something stir within her, a whisper of the woman she used to be. Meanwhile, at the gala, Richard moved through the crowd with ease, charming investors and industry leaders. Daphne clung to his arm, draped in a striking red dress, her every move calculated to draw attention. The evening was unfolding just as he had planned, until it wasn't. A sudden murmur swept through the ballroom. Richard turned instinctively, following the eyes of the crowd to the grand entrance. And there she was, Mary. For a moment, Richard couldn't breathe. He blinked, half expecting her image to disappear like a mirage. But it was real. The woman he had left at home just hours ago was now standing beneath the grand archway, commanding the room's attention. But this wasn't the same Mary he had grown used to overlooking. She wore an elegant black gown, subtly adorned with shimmering beads that caught the light. Her hair cascaded in soft curls, silver earrings framing her face. Her makeup was understated yet striking, highlighting the confidence in her eyes. The guests who once dismissed her now watched with curiosity, whispering among themselves. Waiter offered her a glass of wine, and she accepted it with effortless grace. As she moved through the room, she exuded a presence that made it clear she belonged here. She always had. Richard's grip on his champagne tightened. Every instinct told him to take control, to do something. But he stood frozen, watching as Mary smiled at an approaching figure. George Thomas, well-known real estate mogul, charming and self-assured. He greeted Mary with a warm smile and kissed the back of her hand. They began talking, and within moments, she was laughing in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. Beside him, Daphne shifted, sensing his tension. She gently touched his arm. "What's going on? You've been staring at her for minutes. Who is she?" Richard forced himself to look away, adjusting his collar as if that could mask the growing unease inside him. "No one important," he said. But as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. False. For the first time, Richard wasn't sure if he believed them. Meanwhile, Mary continued her conversation, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing within her husband. George complimented her dress, asked if she was part of the artistic community. She chuckled, admitting she was just beginning to explore that world, but she felt inspired to continue. George, clearly intrigued, handed her his business card, expressing his desire to follow her journey. Richard watched from across the room, unable to look away. The control he had always prided himself on was slipping through his fingers. The carefully crafted image he had built now felt fragile, ready to shatter. A sudden wave of heat rushed through his body. He wanted to approach her, interrupt the conversation, reclaim the authority he had always wielded over her. But something inside him held him back. Then, as if sensing his turmoil, Mary turned and met his gaze. Her expression wasn't confrontational, nor was it submissive. It was steady, clear. As if, for the first time, she truly saw him for who he was. She held his stare for a moment longer before turning back to George, continuing their conversation as if Richard no longer mattered. For the first time in his life, Richard felt powerless, and that terrified him. As the evening unfolded, Mary found herself in a lively conversation with George, one of the honored guests at the gala. He smiled warmly and asked if she was part of the artistic circle being celebrated that night. Mary chuckled softly, admitting that she was just beginning to explore the world of art but felt deeply inspired to continue her journey. George, clearly intrigued, handed her his business card. "I'd love to follow your progress," he said sincerely. Across the room, Richard watched intently, unable to take his eyes off Mary. The composure he had always prided himself on began to slip. The perfect image he had constructed for the night felt fragile, ready to shatter. He tried to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping over him, but it was no use. Deep down, he knew, tonight marked the start of something irreversible. Then, Mary turned and met his gaze. There was no defiance in her eyes, nor was there submission. Instead, her expression was steady, as if she were truly seeing Richard for the first time. After a few lingering moments, she turned back to George, continuing their conversation. A wave of heat surged through Richard. He wanted to step in, to interrupt, to regain control, but something held him back. In that instant, he had to face the truth. Mary was no longer someone he could control, and that terrified him. Beside him, Daphne sighed impatiently, reminding him they were late for an important meeting with an investor. Richard nodded absent-mindedly and followed her, but his thoughts were elsewhere. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. And for the first time, that vulnerability had a name. Mary. As the music played on and guests continued to dance, Richard realized something chilling. In a room full of powerful people, he was the only one who felt as though the ground beneath him was about to collapse. Later that night, Mary stepped into the grand yet empty mansion, closing the door behind her. But for the first time in years, the solitude of the vast, chilly space didn't weigh on her. Her mind replayed the events of the gala, every moment etched into her memory. The sound of her heels echoed against the marble floor, a reminder that something inside her had shifted. She draped her coat over a chair and walked into the living room. The space, carefully curated by Richard with its luxurious furniture and impeccable design, had always felt cold and impersonal. But tonight, she didn't care. She was too focused on the warmth still burning inside her, the glow of newfound confidence, fueled by the admiring glances and encouraging words she had received. Slipping off her shoes, she sank onto the leather sofa with a deep sigh. George Thomas had been charming, but it wasn't just him that made her feel different. Their conversation had merely confirmed what she had begun to realize. She didn't have to hide anymore. For years, she had lived in Richard's shadow, believing she was too small for his world. But now she saw the truth. It had all been a lie she would no longer uphold. Her phone buzzed. A few messages from Richard. He had stayed late at the gala and had sent a short text saying he was heading straight to a business associate's apartment. Mary wasn't surprised. She already knew he would be spending the night with Daphne. But this time, the news didn't sting. She didn't cry. She simply placed her phone on the coffee table and went to the bedroom. She took a hot shower, letting the water wash away any lingering insecurities. When she finally lay down and closed her eyes, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. She wasn't small anymore. And for the first time in years, she slept soundly. The next morning, Mary walked into the kitchen to find Richard already seated at the table, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked relaxed, but Mary knew better. This was the calm of a man who believed he had everything under control. "You got in late," she commented casually, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Richard glanced up, his gaze distracted. "Yeah, it was a long night. Did you enjoy the party?" He asked it lightly, but Mary could hear the tension underneath. He hadn't expected her to make an impression. She smiled as she stirred her coffee. "It was interesting. I met new people, got a few invitations." For a split second, Richard's expression hardened, but he quickly masked it with a condescending tone. "Just be careful, Mary. Events like that can be complicated. Not everyone is genuine." Mary sat across from him and studied him carefully. 4 years, she had craved his approval, done everything to be the perfect wife. But no matter how much she tried, all she ever received was indifference. Now, she no longer needed his validation. "Are you worried about what people thought of me last night?" she asked, her voice calm yet sharp. Richard set down his newspaper and met her gaze. "That's not it," he said carefully. "I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable in situations you're not used to." She took a sip of her coffee and smiled, this time with a touch of irony. "Don't worry, Richard. I didn't feel uncomfortable. In fact, for the first time in a long while, I felt good." He looked away, pretending to focus on his coffee, but she knew he was processing what she had just said. Before he could respond, she stood up. "I have things to do today. Don't wait for me for dinner." Richard watched her leave but said nothing. For the first time, he had no words. He felt a slight discomfort in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Something was shifting, and he wasn't prepared for it. Meanwhile, as Mary stepped outside, the crisp morning air felt refreshing. She got into her car and drove aimlessly for a while before stopping in front of a small art gallery she had passed many times but never dared to enter. For a moment, she hesitated, watching people walk in and out with sketchbooks and paintbrushes. Her heart pounded. But instead of letting fear take over, she took a deep breath and stepped inside. The scent of fresh paint filled the air, mingling with the soft melody of classical music. A friendly woman at the reception desk smiled. "How can I help you?" Mary met her gaze and, for the first time in years, spoke with certainty. "I'd like to enroll in a painting class." Filling out the registration form felt like signing a contract with herself. When she left the gallery with the class schedule tucked into her purse, she felt something stir deep within her, an unfamiliar but thrilling sense of freedom. This wasn't just about picking up a hobby. This was the first step toward reclaiming the life she had abandoned to be the perfect wife. And she was never going back. As Mary strolled through the lively streets, she absorbed everything around her: the laughter of children, the nostalgic melodies from old radios playing Brazilian music, and the rich aroma of food being prepared in small kitchens. The energy of the place made her feel alive, as if the very air was embracing her. "This is the wall we'll be working on today," KMAN said, stopping in front of a large, worn gray surface. "I want to tell the story of Irene Bennett, the woman who lives here. She told us that when she was young, she dreamed of becoming a teacher but had to give it up to raise her children alone. What do you think we can create here?" Mary gazed at the wall, letting her imagination flow. For the first time, she didn't feel hesitant. Instead, she felt an overwhelming urge to express something meaningful. "We could paint something that shows her strength," she suggested. "Maybe an image of her as a young woman, surrounded by books and flowers, as if her dreams were still blooming around her even after all these years. Kman smiled, clearly pleased. "I knew you'd get it." Mary picked up a brush and dipped it into a bucket of blue paint. As she painted, her doubts began to fade. With each stroke, the shapes came to life, and she felt more certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Carmen painted beside her but gave her the space to create freely. By the end of the day, as the sun began to set, Mary stepped back to admire their progress. The mural wasn't finished, but its outline was already powerful. She looked at Carmen, who smiled warmly. "You have a talent you can't ignore any longer, Mary. And over time, you'll realize you don't need anyone's approval but your own." Mary took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. For the first time, she truly believed them. That night, as she returned home, something inside her felt different. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but rather a quiet awakening. Richard hadn't come home yet, but for once, she didn't care. His presence no longer dictated her emotions. Lying in bed, exhausted but fulfilled, she knew this was the beginning of something greater. This time, she had no intention of stopping. Soft background music played in Richard's luxurious apartment, but instead of calming him, it only amplified the unease growing in his chest. Sitting on his sleek white leather sofa, he swirled the amber whiskey in his glass, staring into it as if it held the answers to the chaos taking over his life. And the kitchen, Daphne was laughing on the phone with a friend while mixing a drink. Her laughter, once charming and alluring to Richard, now grated on his nerves. A moment later, she strutted into the living room in a tight dress and high heels, exuding the flawless image he used to admire. She smiled at him, but it felt hollow, superficial. She settled beside him, sliding a manicured hand along his arm. "You've been so distant lately," she said, taking a sip of her cocktail. "Is something wrong at work?" Richard slowly shook his head. "No. Just tired." Daphne tossed her blonde hair to the side in a deliberate move. "Then we need a trip. How about the French Riviera? We could rent a yacht and escape all of this." Richard forced a smile, but the thought of being confined with Daphne in an isolated setting made his stomach churn. He looked away, taking a long sip of whiskey. Why did her presence suddenly feel unbearable? There was a time when he believed she was perfect, the ideal, dazzling woman everyone envied. But now, all he saw was an empty shell. "Maybe later," he muttered, setting his glass on the table. Daphne huffed, crossing her arms. "You've been acting strange since that gala. What happened that night?" Richard met her gaze but didn't answer. He knew exactly what had happened. Mary happened. The image of her, elegant, confident, was still seared into his mind. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push it away. Mary, the woman he had once dismissed and underestimated, now haunted his every thought. "It's nothing. You're imagining things," he said, his tone colder than he intended. Daphne rolled her eyes, stood up, and stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the apartment, but Richard barely noticed. He sat there, alone, letting the silence settle over him like a suffocating weight. The whiskey wasn't helping. Setting the glass aside, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through old photos. His fingers stopped on one taken years ago, a picture of Mary on a beach trip. She wore a simple white dress, her hair blowing in the wind, her smile radiant and full of life. When was the last time he had seen her smile like that? Over time, he had erased the little details, the way she would burst into laughter at his terrible jokes, how her eyes lit up when she talked about painting and literature, the candlelit dinners she would prepare for him despite her exhaustion. But he had chosen ambition over love. He had built a life of appearances, parties, and empty victories. And now, as Mary found a world where he no longer mattered, her absence burned in a way he couldn't explain. Restless, he stood and wandered through the apartment, opening drawers aimlessly. He stumbled upon a forgotten box tucked in a closet corner. Inside were birthday cards from Mary, photos of their trips, and the little notes she used to leave him. He picked up one. "I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm always by your side, my love." His throat tightened. 4 years, he had dismissed her gestures as trivial. Now, each word felt like a knife to the heart. Collapsing onto the sofa, he placed the note on his chest, staring at the ceiling. His mind spun, desperate to understand how he had let things come to this. He wanted to turn back time, but deep down, he knew it was impossible. His phone vibrated beside him. A message from Daphne. He ignored it. The name he wanted to see wasn't there, and that realization gutted him. He thought about the way Mary had looked at him that night, not with sadness, but with a quiet strength. It was as if she had finally stopped waiting for him. Richard closed his eyes, but sleep never came. The emptiness inside him was overwhelming, and whiskey could no longer drown it. For the first time, he faced the truth. He wasn't just losing his wife, he was losing the only person who had ever truly loved him. And he wasn't sure if he could ever get her back. Mary took a step back, wiping a drop of sweat from her forehead as she admired the mural. The orange and pink hues of the evening sky cast a warm glow over the artwork, making it feel even more alive. What was once a dull, worn-out wall had transformed into a vibrant piece of storytelling, a tribute to the resilience and dreams of the people who lived there. Kman stood beside her, holding a bucket of paint, his expression filled with pride. "It's perfect, Mary. You've captured Irene Bennett's story and the spirit of this community. People will remember this mural for a long time." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging. "I feel like I'm part of this, not just the art, but the history. For the first time, I feel truly alive." Carmen, standing nearby, nodded approvingly and patted Mary on the shoulder. "That's because you're finally living for yourself, without waiting for permission. And I can't wait to see how far you'll go." Before Mary could respond, a smooth male voice echoed down the street. "So this is the Mary Carmen has been telling me about." She turned to see a tall man with tousled brown hair and a light beard approaching. He wore a wrinkled linen shirt and paint-stained khaki pants, a backpack slung over his shoulder. His brown eyes carried a curious sparkle, as if he was always searching for something just beyond the surface. "Brandon!" Carmen exclaimed, hurrying over to embrace him. "I was hoping you'd show up. I want you to meet Mary, the artist making this project so special." Mary extended her hand, a little shy but intrigued. "Nice to meet you." Brandon shook her hand with a firm but relaxed grip. "The pleasure is mine. I've heard a lot about you. Kman can't stop raving about your work." Mary chuckled, feeling a mix of flattery and humility. "I'm just getting started." Brandon smiled knowingly. "We're all always just getting started. But from what I see, you've already taken some big steps. This mural is incredible." Carmen, sensing a connection forming, winked at Mary and stepped back. "I'm going to check on the team down the street. You two should talk." Mary chuckled softly at Carmen's not-so-subtle exit but didn't object. She and Brandon began walking along the street, passing other murals being painted by volunteers. The evening air was cool, filled with the sound of chatter and laughter from the neighborhood. "So, you're an art curator?" Mary asked. Brandon nodded. "Yes, but I'm also an activist. I connect art projects with communities that need cultural revitalization. I've worked in different cities, always learning something new. When Carmen told me about this project and about you, I had to see it for myself." Mary glanced at him, curiosity growing. "What exactly did she tell you?" He laughed, running a hand through his hair. "She said you're an artist rediscovering herself, but that you already have a clear vision of how to use your art to transform lives. And from what I'm seeing, she wasn't exaggerating." The compliment made Mary pause. She had spent so long looking for validation from Richard, but now she wanted to trust herself. Still, Brandon's words felt sincere. "I don't know if my vision is clear yet," she admitted. "I just know that, for the first time in years, I feel like I'm on the right path." Brandon stopped walking and met her gaze. "And that's enough. You don't need to have all the answers yet. What matters is that you're moving forward." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt like both of them were absorbing the moment. Mary felt light next to him, free of expectations. They continued walking until they reached a large tree at the end of the street. Brandon leaned against the trunk, taking in the murals around them. "Have you thought about expanding this kind of work to other neighborhoods? There are plenty of places that could use someone like you." Mary hesitated. The idea felt overwhelming but also thrilling. "Kman mentioned it, but I'm still processing everything. I don't want to take on more than I can handle." Brandon nodded. "I get that. But when you're ready, let me know. I have contacts who can help." His gaze was steady, without pressure. Unlike Richard, Brandon didn't seem like someone who wanted to control her. That put her at ease. When they returned to the mural, Mary felt energized. Her conversation with Brandon had opened new possibilities in her mind. More importantly, she felt seen, not just as a woman rebuilding herself, but as an artist with a purpose. That night, as she sat on her couch with a cup of tea, she reflected on how far she had come. Carmen, the residents of Villa Esperanza, and now Brandon, they had all played a part in her journey. But more than anything, it was her own choices that had brought her here. Richard still wasn't home. The clock passed 10, but this time, his absence didn't sting. She didn't need him to feel complete. There was an entire world waiting for her, and for the first time, she was ready to step into it, without fear. Mary glanced at Richard briefly before turning away. "I need to get back to work." "Enjoy the exhibition," she said, walking off without looking back. Richard stood in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by people who barely noticed him. He watched as Mary joined a group of artists and visitors, laughing at something someone had said. At that moment, she felt as distant from him as a star in the sky, and the days that followed, Richard tried everything. He sent flowers to her home, accompanied by handwritten notes, something he hadn't done since the early days of their marriage. He sent messages apologizing, inviting her to dinner so they could talk. But she didn't respond. Each unanswered message felt like knocking on a door that would never open. On the fourth night, he decided to wait for her outside the gallery after closing. The cold air bit at his skin as he anxiously rubbed his hands together for warmth, his eyes fixed on the entrance. When he finally saw her step out, a scarf wrapped around her neck and a leather bag slung over her shoulder, his heart pounded. Taking a few steps toward her, he called out, "Mary, please. Just give me 5 minutes." She stopped and met his gaze. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but no weakness, only resolve. "Richard, what you're doing isn't fair. You had years to listen to me, to see me. Now, just because you realize you've lost me, you expect me to drop everything and come back? That's not how this works." Richard took a deep breath, struggling to hide the desperation creeping into his voice. "I know I failed you, but I'm willing to change. Tell me what to do." She shook her head, her voice steady but not unkind. "There's nothing you can do. This isn't about you anymore. For the first time, my life is about me." She turned and walked away, her footsteps on the pavement echoing in his ears. Richard stood there, watching her disappear around the corner, a deep, sinking feeling settling in his chest. When he finally returned to his car, the weight of his choices felt unbearable. He knew he was losing her for good, but he didn't know how to stop trying to win her back. And yet, a part of him was beginning to understand. Maybe it was already too late. The market in Villa Esperanza was alive with color and energy. Banners fluttered between the stalls, children ran past laughing, and the sound of street musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies. It was a bright, sunny morning, and at the heart of the event, Mary stood beside Carmen, putting the final touches on a booth displaying the latest collective mural. The project had gained traction in recent weeks, drawing attention from journalists and curious onlookers alike. As Mary secured a decorative banner to the wooden structure, her focus shifted when she spotted Brandon approaching, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He wore jeans and a slightly wrinkled white shirt, his hair tousled by the breeze. Her heart gave a small leap at the sight of him, but unlike before, it wasn't an anxious rush. It was something warmer, steadier. "For you," he said, handing her a cup. "Strong coffee, no sugar. I remembered you like it that way." She smiled as she accepted it. "Thank you. You're getting good at showing up with coffee at just the right moments." Brandon shrugged with a grin. "It's one of my many talents." They walked together to a shaded bench, watching the lively fair unfold around them. Mary took a deep breath, letting the energy of the moment settle within her. It had been so long since she felt this connected, to herself, to a purpose, to something bigger than the past. Brandon studied her for a moment before speaking. "You've been doing incredible work. The people here talk about you like you're a local hero." Mary laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm no hero, Brandon. I'm just trying to give back some of what this community has given me." "And that's exactly what makes you special," he said. "You're not trying to stand out, you're making a difference." A warmth spread through her, not from embarrassment but from gratitude. With Brandon, there was no expectation to be someone else, no pressure to fit into a mold. He saw her for who she was and appreciated her completely. As they sipped their coffee, he asked about her future plans for the project. Mary explained her vision, expanding to other neighborhoods, connecting artists with marginalized communities. Brandon listened attentively, offering thoughtful suggestions without ever trying to take over. "I can help with that," he said eventually. "I know people who'd love to fund something like this. We could plan it together, if you'd like." Mary was touched by his offer. It wasn't a demand, it was an invitation. And that was exactly what she needed. "That would be great," she said, "but only if it's something you really want to do." "I do," he said, without hesitation. "But more than that, I want to see you grow." She looked away for a moment, swallowing the sudden emotion that rose in her chest. For years, she had thought love meant giving up parts of herself. Now, she was learning it could be something else entirely. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by silence. The once stunning view of the city outside his windows now felt meaningless. The expensive furniture, the carefully curated artwork, none of it mattered anymore. Near midnight, he sat on his leather couch, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey beside him. The alcohol did little to dull the growing emptiness. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, and each night felt longer than the last. Daphne had left 2 days ago after yet another argument about his detachment. But as he sat there, Richard realized something shocking. He didn't care that she was gone. Her presence, once a point of pride, had become just another reminder of his mistakes. He got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were alive, but he felt completely disconnected. He tried to tell himself that his wealth, his status, his connections still meant something. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was Mary. Her absence was deafening. He couldn't stop wondering what she was doing. Was she painting? Laughing with friends? Was she with Brandon? The thought sliced through him. 2 days later, he sat in the waiting room of a therapist's office. A friend had recommended it. At first, he resisted. Therapy wasn't for people like him. Or so he had believed. But the weight of his regrets had become unbearable. When the therapist finally asked, "What brings you here today?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "I lost the only person who ever really knew me," he admitted, rubbing his face. "And now, my life doesn't make sense anymore." For the first time, he spoke honestly. About his obsession with status. About how he had pushed Mary aside. About the moment he realized, at the gallery, that the woman he once dismissed was so much more than he had ever allowed himself to see. "She looked at me that night like she didn't need me anymore," he said, his voice cracking. "And it broke me." He wasn't sure if he could fix anything, but for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what he had lost, and why. Richard sat in silence, his mind spinning. He had just seen Mary at the exhibition, glowing with happiness, a world away from the woman he once knew. He turned to Carmen, shaking his head. "I don't know how to deal with this. She looked so happy, so different." Carmen gave him a knowing look. "She's not different, Richard. The truth is, you never really knew the real Mary. You only saw the version of her that tried so hard to please you." Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. He opened his mouth to argue but couldn't. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent years shaping an ideal version of Mary in his mind, never truly seeing her for who she was. Carmen continued, her voice steady but without cruelty. "She's found something more than what you could ever offer her. She's found herself." Richard ran his hands over his face, struggling to swallow the lump in his throat. "And I lost her." "Not necessarily," Carmen said. "You can still learn from this. The real question is, do you want to become a better person, or do you just want to ease your guilt?" He sat there, stunned. For the first time, he realized it wasn't just about Mary. It was about him. It was about finding himself, too. Carmen finished her coffee and stood up, tucking a sketchbook under her arm. Before leaving, she looked at him one last time. "I don't know what the future holds for you, Richard. But I do know this. Mary is okay. She's finally living the life she always wanted. If you really love her, maybe it's time you accept that." As she walked away, Richard stayed put, staring at his untouched coffee. He had hit rock bottom, not just in loneliness, but in the painful clarity that love alone couldn't fix the past. The cafe was warm and inviting, with the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. Conversations hummed around the room, blending with the occasional clink of dishes. Outside, the sky was cloudy, a perfect backdrop for what felt like a final chapter. Mary stepped inside and immediately spotted Richard sitting by the window. His hands were clasped together, his gaze locked on the cup of coffee in front of him. He noticed her before she reached him, his expression shifting as if reality had just hit him. She looked different. There was a calmness about her, a quiet confidence. Dressed simply in a light blue blouse with a beige scarf draped around her neck, she radiated peace. "Hi, Richard," she said, taking the seat across from him. He let out a quiet sigh of relief, as if he had feared she wouldn't come. He hesitated before speaking, as if gathering his thoughts. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you would." Mary nodded. "I thought about it a lot," she admitted, placing her bag beside her. "But I decided it was important." A waiter approached, and she ordered a black coffee, no sugar. The brief silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Richard's spoon stirring his coffee, though he hadn't taken a sip. "I don't know where to start," he finally said, looking her in the eyes. "There's so much I want to say." Mary waited, her expression calm and patient. "I'm sorry, Mary," he said. "For everything. For not seeing you, for making you feel like you weren't enough. I thought I was building a perfect life, but I was blind. Now I see how much I lost." Mary didn't respond right away, but her silence wasn't cold, it was strong. He felt even more vulnerable under her gaze. "I remember when you used to say all you wanted was to be happy with me," Richard continued, his voice shaking. "And I pushed you away. But I see it now. I understand who you are. You're incredible, Mary, and I was blind to it all. I just want a chance to do things differently." A tear escaped down his cheek, and he quickly wiped it away. This wasn't something he was used to, showing weakness, admitting pain, feeling regret. But if there was ever a moment to drop his pride, it was now. Mary sighed, lowering her gaze for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "I believe you, Richard. I believe that you're sorry and that you finally see things clearly. But I'm not the woman you're trying to get back." Richard froze. Her words created an invisible wall between them, one he couldn't climb over. Her voice was gentle but firm. "For a long time, all I wanted was for you to really see me. I changed myself to fit into your world, hoping you would love me for who I was. But in doing that, I lost myself. When you finally saw me at the gala, Richard, I wasn't waiting for you anymore. I had found myself." She paused, taking a deep breath. Richard ran his hands over his face, feeling desperation rise in his chest. "I know it's late, but I love you, Mary. And I know I can do better." For a brief moment, her heart ached. She knew how much those words had meant in the past. But now, they meant something different. "I believe you love me, Richard," she said. "But I love myself, too. And I can't go back to the version of me I worked so hard to leave behind." Silence settled between them. The waiter set Mary's coffee down, but she barely noticed. Richard looked at her, tears pooling in his eyes. "So, this is the end?" Mary gave him a small, soft smile. There was no cruelty in it, just certainty. "It's not the end for you, Richard," she said. "It's a new beginning. But I won't be by your side on this journey. I'm finally living the life I always dreamed of. And my path is moving forward." For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The weight of her words crushed him. He wanted to beg, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Mary had already made her decision. She picked up her bag, took one last sip of coffee, and stood up. Richard sat still, watching her, as if trying to memorize every detail. "Goodbye, Richard," she said, her voice steady as she stepped outside. The cold wind brushed against her face, but she didn't mind. It felt fresh, like a symbol of the freedom she had finally embraced. Across the street, Brandon stood waiting, leaning against a lamp post. When he saw her, he smiled, not with excitement, but with understanding. He knew she needed to face this chapter alone. She walked over to him, slipping her hand into his. They didn't need words. The silence between them was comfortable, something she never knew was possible. As they walked together down the street, Mary looked up at the cloudy sky and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Her past was behind her. And her future, that was hers to build, on her own terms. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below to share your thoughts. See you in the next video.